Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst, or perhaps more accurately, snow boot first, into the chilling world of early 20th century Antarctic expeditions. Imagine you're there. The wind, a physical entity, is trying to sandpaper your face off with ice crystals. Every breath is a shock of cold, and the silence, well, it's only broken by the groaning of the ice and maybe the distant, slightly judgmental squawk of a penguin wondering what on earth you're doing there. It's a landscape so alien and unforgiving. You probably wouldn't survive the first week on your modern wits alone, especially if your idea of roughing it involves a lukewarm latte. These expeditions were feats of incredible endurance, but also, as we'll discover, incredibly strange logistical nightmares, especially when it came to packing the snacks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're all tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world, so drop a comment below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the dock, let's say sometime around 1901 or maybe 1910. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke, tarred ropes, and the general, musty aroma of a ship that's seen a bit of life. Before you is a vessel, probably a wooden one, its timbers groaning even now as it's loaded to the absolute brim. This isn't just a trip, it's a multi-year commitment to existing in a place that actively, almost personally, wants you gone. The sheer scale of provisioning such a venture is enough to make your modern mind, accustomed to next-day delivery and 24-hour supermarkets, do a gentle, sleepy backflip. Think about it. Dozens of men, sometimes as many as 60 or 70, venturing into a white, indifferent wilderness for 2, maybe 3 years. There are no resupply depots, no friendly ports of call, no popping down to the corner store because someone forgot the extra sugar. Once that ship leaves the last civilized outpost, often a remote whaling station in South Georgia or a port in New Zealand, you and your companions are entirely on your own. The journey south itself could take months, battling through the notoriously rough Southern Ocean, a place where waves have been unkindly described as liquid mountains with anger issues. It's a mainstream historical fact that these voyages under sail and early steam power were incredibly time-consuming, isolating the crews long before they even set foot on the ice. So what do you pack for such an extended, unwelcome stay in the planet's freezer? Everything. Absolutely everything you might conceivably need, from the obvious, like food and fuel, down to the needles and thread for mending your rapidly deteriorating socks. The decks of these ships would be a chaotic landscape of crates, barrels, sacks, and even live animals. Dogs, essential for sledging, would be barking and whining. Ponies, another popular if somewhat less successful choice for Antarctic transport, would be stamping nervously. And all around this, men would be shouting, winches creaking, as literally tons of supplies were manhandled aboard. You'd probably find yourself questioning the sanity of it all, and frankly, you wouldn't be the first. The primary challenge, of course, was food. How do you keep enough food for that many men, for that long, without it turning into something a self-respecting rat would snub? Refrigeration, as we know it, wasn't a reliable option for the holds of these ships, nor for the primitive huts they'd eventually build on the ice. So, the planners relied heavily on methods of preservation that had been around for centuries: salting, drying, and the relatively newer technology of canning. The sheer tonnage of tinned goods was astronomical. Tinned meats of dubious origin, tinned vegetables that were often a mushy memory of their former selves, tinned butter, tinned cheese, tinned everything. It's a wonder the can opener wasn't the most revered piece of equipment on the expedition. You might joke that the official expedition motto should have been, if in doubt, tin it. Then there's the knowledge, or rather, the alarming lack of it in certain key areas. While these were scientific expeditions, the science of nutrition was still in its infancy. They knew scurvy was a problem, this dreaded disease that led to lethargy, rotting gums, and eventually death. But the exact cause, a lack of vitamin C, wasn't fully understood or universally accepted. Theories abounded, some blaming tainted tinned meat, others poor air quality. This led to some truly strange anti-scorbutics being packed, some of which were as useful as carrying a parasol in a blizzard. Historians still argue whether the stubbornness of some expedition leaders to accept fresh seal meat, a known antiscorbutic used by indigenous Arctic peoples and whalers, over familiar tinned rations contributed more to tragic outcomes than the ice itself. And it wasn't just about what you packed, but how much it weighed and how much space it took up. Every single item had to be laboriously unloaded from the ship, often onto precarious sea ice, then sledged, sometimes for miles, to the chosen site for the winter base. Then, for any inland journey, every biscuit, every lump of sugar, every block of fuel had to be hauled by men, dogs, or those unfortunate ponies. This led to an obsessive focus on caloric density versus weight. Food needed to provide the maximum energy for the minimum bulk. This thinking is what led to the dominance of items like pemmican, which we'll explore more later. But imagine trying to plan your weekly grocery shop with the added constraint that you might have to personally drag it up a glacier. Your shopping habits might change a tad. The era itself, often called the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, was one defined by a peculiar mix of bravery, ambition, and a healthy dose of simply not knowing what they were truly up against. They were sailing off the edge of the known world, not just geographically, but also in terms of human endurance. The provisions reflected this, a combination of the best available technology and knowledge of the time, alongside items that seem, with our comfortable hindsight, utterly bizarre or woefully inadequate. As a quirky tidbit, some early expeditions even packed things like elaborate silver dinner services, or in one documented case, a full-sized, if small, billiard table, presumably for those quiet evenings when you weren't, fighting for your life against a howling blizzard. The logistics of getting a billiard table onto the Antarctic continent in 1902 almost boggles the mind more than the cold. So, as you settle deeper into your blankets, try to picture the scene. The immense, creaking ship, a tiny speck of human endeavor against the vast, uncaring ocean, heading towards an even more vast, uncaring continent. Inside its belly, a meticulously calculated, yet often flawed, collection of everything its inhabitants believed they would need to survive. It's a testament to human resilience, and perhaps a testament to the fact that sometimes, not knowing exactly how difficult something will be is the only reason we attempt it in the first place. The weight of responsibility on the expedition planners must have been immense, trying to anticipate every need, every emergency, in a place where the nearest help was thousands of miles and many months away. You couldn't just Amazon Prime a new tin opener if yours broke. You're beginning to appreciate, then, this incredible balancing act the expedition planners faced, this constant, nagging worry about weight versus sustenance we touched upon. Everything had to earn its place on the sledges, and nothing earned it quite so emphatically, or with such a mixed reputation, as pemmican. Now, if you've never had the distinct, shall we say, experience of pemmican, allow me to paint you a picture. It is, at its heart, a marvel of nutritional engineering, a true powerhouse of calories, and it's a mainstream historical fact that its origins lie with the indigenous peoples of North America, who perfected it as a trail food centuries before any European explorers thought of slapping on some snowshoes. They knew a thing or two about surviving harsh conditions with minimal fuss. So what exactly is this wonder food? Imagine taking lean meat, bison, caribou, or in the case of Antarctic expeditions, usually beef, and drying it until it's almost brittle, like a very unappetizing meat rusk. Then, you pound this dried meat into a near powder. Next, you take animal fat, lots of it, render it down into liquid tallow, and then mix this molten fat with the powdered meat, roughly in a 50-50 ratio by weight. Sometimes, for a bit of variety, dried berries might be added, though this was less common in the Antarctic versions, which were all about a no-nonsense, grim-faced approach to calorie intake. This concoction was then pressed into blocks or packed tightly into tins. The result was a dense, incredibly energy-rich substance that, in theory, could last for years if prepared and stored correctly. And when you're facing starvation in a landscape that offers precisely zero natural food sources for hundreds of miles, energy-rich and last for years are two very beautiful phrases. The sheer caloric density was its main selling point. A single pound of pemmican could provide thousands of calories, far more than the equivalent weight of fresh meat or bread. This made it the undisputed king of sledge rations. You could carry enough energy for days in a relatively small, albeit heavy, package. But as you chip a piece off a frozen block with your knife, the wind howling around your frost-nipped ears, you might start to understand why it was also frequently reviled. Let's talk about the taste and texture, shall we? Or perhaps the determined lack thereof. Good quality pemmican, if such a thing truly existed in the Antarctic context, was often described as relatively bland, with a slightly waxy or tallowy taste from the fat. Bad quality pemmican, on the other hand, could be anything from slightly off to actively rancid to possessing a flavor that could make a starving man pause for thought. The texture, especially when cold, was often likened to trying to chew on a block of hard, greasy wax, or perhaps, as one particularly disgruntled explorer put it, like eating a candle with occasional meaty threads. It wasn't exactly melt in your mouth. It was the original energy bar, just, slightly more existential in its culinary appeal. The process of making it commercially for these grand expeditions wasn't always a gourmet affair either. Large contracts were given out, and consistency could vary wildly. You might imagine vast, steaming vats of rendered fat and mechanical grinders pulverizing dried meat, all on an industrial scale. It's a far cry from a carefully prepared artisan product. There are tales, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, of all sorts of floor sweepings and undesirable bits making their way into the mix. One quirky tidbit often whispered about is that some less scrupulous manufacturers, looking to cut costs on the expensive meat powder, might have incorporated other, cheaper protein sources, though proving this now is nigh on impossible. It certainly wouldn't have improved the already challenging flavor profile. So how did you, as an early 20th century Antarctic explorer, consume this brick of joy? Most commonly, it was eaten cold, just not on throughout the day during brief halts on the march. This required strong teeth and a stronger stomach. Alternatively, and much preferred if fuel and time allowed, it would be chipped into a pot, melted down with snow, and boiled up into a sort of greasy stew or gruel called hush. Often, broken pieces of ship's biscuit would be thrown in to thicken it and add some carbohydrates. This warm, fatty, protein-rich slurry, while still not exactly haute cuisine, was at least warm, and that counted for a lot when the temperature outside your tent was testing the very limits of what a thermometer could register. You might even find yourself looking forward to hush, which probably says more about the prevailing conditions than the dish itself. Despite the comfort of a warm meal, the monotony of a diet heavily reliant on pemmican, day after day, week after week, sometimes month after month on those long polar journeys, was psychologically brutal. Men craved variety, craved different textures and tastes, and pemmican offered none of that. It was fuel, pure and simple. Diaries from these expeditions are filled with descriptions of pemmican, ranging from stoic acceptance to outright loathing. Food, as we know, is a huge morale booster, and when your primary source of sustenance is something you actively dislike, it can cast a real pall over the spirit. It's like being told your only entertainment for the next 6 months is listening to the same out-of-tune song on repeat. You'd manage, but you wouldn't exactly be dancing. Historians still argue whether the nutritional deficiencies in some early pemmican recipes, particularly regarding certain vitamins or the precise type of fat used. Some fats are more prone to rancidity or lack essential fatty acids, contributed significantly to the health problems experienced on long sledge journeys. While pemmican provided calories and protein in abundance, it wasn't a complete food. The lack of certain micronutrients, especially when fresh food wasn't available for extended periods, could have exacerbated conditions like scurvy or generally weaken the men, even if they weren't actually starving in a caloric sense. Yet, for all its faults, for all the greasy texture and the often uninspiring taste, pemmican was considered utterly indispensable. Without its concentrated energy, the great overland treks that defined the heroic age, the dashes to the South Pole, the long exploratory journeys into unknown territory, simply could not have been undertaken. There was no viable alternative that packed so much punch for its weight. So, you'd eat your daily ration, perhaps grumbling under your breath, perhaps dreaming of a fresh apple or a slice of bread and butter, but you'd eat it. Because out there, in that vast, frozen silence, pemmican, for all its sins, was life. It was the dense, unappetizing, waxy key to unlocking the secrets of the last continent on Earth. And as you drift off to sleep, you can almost feel that slightly greasy, heavy sensation in your own stomach, a phantom of meals past, fueling phantom journeys across endless, starlit ice. So, you've got your daily ration of pemmican, that dense, fatty, life-sustaining substance. But man, or even a very sleepy listener, cannot live on pemmican alone, mostly because your teeth would probably stage a mutiny. You need carbohydrates, something to burn for quick energy on those long, cold marches, something to perhaps soak up a bit of the grease from your pemmican hush. And that's where the ship's biscuit, the legendary hardtack, marches resolutely onto the scene, probably making a loud, clunking noise as it arrives. Imagine a cracker, but one that's been through some sort of food-based boot camp, emerging stripped of all moisture, all tenderness, all joy. That's your ship's biscuit. It's a mainstream historical fact that these incredibly durable, unleavened biscuits have been a staple for sailors and soldiers for centuries, prized not for their culinary delight, because they possessed absolutely none, but for their extraordinary keeping qualities. Made from the simplest of ingredients, usually just flour and water, perhaps a touch of salt if the baker was feeling generous, they were baked, and then probably baked a little more, until they were, well, hard as a tack, or a very uncooperative paving stone. The idea was to remove every last molecule of moisture that might encourage mold or spoilage, ensuring they could theoretically last for years, if not decades. You might suspect some of the biscuits on these early 20th century expeditions had seen service in previous wars, or perhaps even dated back to the construction of the pyramids. The hardness cannot be overstated. You wouldn't so much bite into a ship's biscuit as declare war on it. Stories abound of men needing to use hammers, the butts of their rifles, or a conveniently placed rock to break them into manageable pieces. Your dental plan, had such a thing existed in the Antarctic in 1905, would have been utterly insufficient. Trying to gnaw on one dry often resulted in little more than a sore jaw and a few sad crumbs. The most common method of consumption was to soak them. You'd drop a chunk into your hot tea or cocoa, assuming you had any, and wait patiently for it to absorb enough liquid to become vaguely chewable, transforming from a potential weapon into something merely stubborn. Or, as we mentioned, they were crumbled into the evening hush, adding a bit of starchy bulk to the pemmican stew. And the taste? Well, taste is a generous word. They were mostly flavorless, perhaps with a faint, dusty aroma of old flour. If they'd been stored for a long time, or in damp conditions despite all precautions, they might acquire a slightly musty or even actively sour note. But generally, their defining characteristic was a profound neutrality, a blank canvas upon which you could project all your cravings for actual, flavorful food. You might find yourself staring at a biscuit, willing it to taste like a warm, buttered scone, only for it to stare back with the cold, hard indifference of a true survivor. Of course, one of the most famous, or infamous, aspects of ship's biscuits was their tendency to host uninvited guests. Weevils. Yes, those tiny beetles and their larvae often found the dry, starchy environment of a barrel of hardtack to be a five-star resort. You'd break open a biscuit and find it riddled with little tunnels, and, if you were particularly observant, the residents themselves. Now, the old sailor's trick was to tap the biscuit on the table before eating, encouraging the weevils to fall out. Or, you could just eat them in the dark and try not to think about it too much. Some men, with that characteristic explorer's dark humor, would refer to the weevils as extra protein or mobile rations, which is one way to look at it, I suppose. It's certainly a budget-friendly approach to supplementing your diet. Given the challenges of hardtack, any variation was welcomed. This is where bannock sometimes made an appearance, especially during periods in winter quarters when there was more time and fuel for baking. Bannock is a simple, unleavened flatbread, made with flour, water, and perhaps a little fat, like lard or penguin blubber if things were getting creative, and a pinch of sugar or salt if available. You'd mix it into a dough and cook it in a frying pan over the blubber stove, or even on a heated stone. While still basic, the very act of eating something freshly cooked, something warm and slightly softer than a piece of kiln-fired pottery, was a significant morale booster. It felt like real food, a small touch of domesticity in the vast, icy wilderness. The smell of bannock cooking, however faint, could make a wooden hut feel almost like a home. The sheer quantity of biscuits required for an expedition was staggering. Tons of them would be packed in especially made tins or stout wooden casks, designed to be as airtight and watertight as possible. You can imagine the scene on the ice, as these heavy containers were unloaded from the ship and sledged to the base hut, an endless parade of carbohydrates, the fuel for countless miles of man-hauling. Each man might be allocated a specific number per day, a ration that seemed generous at first but would quickly become a monotonous necessity. A quirky tidbit that sometimes emerges from expedition diaries is the almost sentimental attachment, or at least grim respect, men developed for certain batches or types of biscuit. Perhaps one brand was slightly less likely to shatter your molars, or another had a more consistent, if still bland, flavor. There are even accounts of men using particularly robust biscuits for unintended purposes, a makeshift shim for a wobbly table leg, or even, in jest, as a paperweight for charts threatening to blow away in the hot. One can almost hear the conversation. Pass me that Scott's patent indestructible number 3, will you? This map needs serious discipline. Historians still argue whether the sheer monotony and poor palatability of the biscuit ration, on top of other dietary deficiencies, had a more significant cumulative impact on morale and physical endurance than previously acknowledged. While calories are crucial, the psychological aspect of food, the enjoyment and satisfaction it brings, also plays a vital role in sustaining human endeavor, especially under extreme stress. Eating identical, tasteless, incredibly hard biscuits day after day, often as your primary source of carbohydrate, could grind down even the most stoic individual. It's one thing to survive. It's another to feel human while doing it. So, as you drift off, imagine the satisfying, or perhaps alarming, crunch of a ship's biscuit. Feel its unyielding texture. Taste its profound neutrality. It's the silent, stoic partner to the greasy pemmican, the carbohydrate bedrock of your Antarctic diet. Not exciting, not delicious, but there. Always there. Like a very, very old and slightly dusty friend who you don't particularly like, but whose presence you rely on more than you'd care to admit. So, you're there, nursing your jaw after a valiant attempt to conquer a ship's biscuit, or perhaps patiently watching one dissolve into your lukewarm tea. That biscuit, as uninspiring as it might be, often found itself in the company of something far more mysterious, something delivered from the clanking, metallic heart of the expedition's larder, the tin can. We've touched on biscuits being packed in tins, but that was just the gateway. For an early 20th century Antarctic expedition, the tin can wasn't just a container. It was a veritable Pandora's box of preserved sustenance, a cylindrical promise of something other than pemmican or hardtack. The technology of canning, or appertization, after its inventor Nicholas Appert, was a game-changer for long-duration travel, and it's a mainstream historical fact that by the time of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, it was a well-established, if not always perfectly executed, method of food preservation. Without it, the sheer variety of foodstuffs, however limited it might seem to our modern palates, would have been impossible to transport and store for years in such an unforgiving climate. You can almost hear the sigh of relief from the expedition quartermaster as he ticked off tinned mutton or tinned peas on his endless inventory list. Now, when we say variety, you have to use that term with a generous pinch of salt, or perhaps a pinch of whatever preservative they were using that week. Yes, the labels might have proudly proclaimed prime roast beef, selected garden peas, or finest creamery butter, but after months, sometimes years, of storage, enduring temperature fluctuations on the voyage south, and then the deep freeze of an Antarctic hut, the contents could be, well, surprising. You might find yourself peering into a newly opened tin with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Was this the day for a culinary triumph, or another round of guess the congealed substance? Tinned meats formed a significant portion of these canned treasures. Corned beef, or bully beef, as it was commonly known, was a staple, a dense, salty, shreddy mass that could be eaten cold or fried up if you had the fat and inclination. Then there was boiled mutton, often swimming in a rather alarming amount of its own congealed fat jelly. Tinned sausages, tinned rabbits, various forms of potted meat. The list was long, if not always distinguished. The excitement of opening a tin labeled Oxford sausages might quickly dissipate when confronted with a pale, anemic-looking collection of mystery cylinders. It led to a sort of grim culinary archaeology. What do you reckon this was, lads, before it achieved this unique state of being? And vegetables? Oh, the valiant attempts to bring the goodness of the garden to the Antarctic. Tins of peas, carrots, beans, and even potatoes were lugged across the globe. The intention was noble, aiming to provide some semblance of a balanced diet and ward off the dreaded scurvy. However, the canning process of the era often involved prolonged cooking at high temperatures, which, while excellent for preservation, tended to turn the vibrant colors and textures of fresh vegetables into a rather homogeneous, khaki-colored mush. Your tinned peas might be more of a suggestion of pea than the crisp, sweet morsels you remembered from home. Still, any break from the relentless meat and biscuit regime was often welcomed, even if it was just a spoonful of something vaguely green. Dairy products also found their way into tins, much to the relief of men craving fats and familiar comforts. Tinned butter was common, though it had a tendency to separate and become oily, sometimes even acquiring a cheesy tang that wasn't entirely intentional. Tinned cheese itself could be surprisingly resilient, a hard, salty block that, if you were lucky, retained some of its character. More ubiquitous were condensed and evaporated milk. Sweetened condensed milk, thick and sugary, was a particular treat, often doled out sparingly to sweeten tea or cocoa, or even eaten neat with a spoon by those with a particularly strong sweet tooth and a moment of privacy. It was like a little tube of liquid happiness in an otherwise very unsweet world. Let's not forget tinned fish. Herrings in tomato sauce, sardines packed in oil, sometimes even tinned salmon. For men tired of the endless parade of red meat, a tin of fish could be a welcome change, providing different flavors and fatty acids. However, a damaged or poorly sealed tin of fish had the potential for olfactory devastation within the confined space of a hut, creating a miasma that could linger for days, a pungent reminder of the ocean they'd left so far behind. You'd probably develop an incredibly keen sense of smell for a bad tin from 50 paces. The suspicious nature of some tinned goods wasn't just about the texture or taste. Quality control in the early 1900s was not the stringent, regulated process it is today. Tins could be improperly sealed, leading to bacterial contamination. Blown tins, those with bulging lids, were a clear sign of trouble, indicating gas production from spoilage, a potential botulism bomb, though the men wouldn't have necessarily understood the exact microbiology, just that it was best avoided. A quirky tidbit you might unearth in some expedition accounts is the almost ritualistic way tins were inspected before opening, tapped and prodded, held up to the ear for any telltale signs of internal rebellion. One particularly notorious batch of tinned pemmican from one supplier was reportedly so bad on a certain expedition that it was eventually relegated to dog food, and even the dogs were said to be dubious. Opening these metallic treasure chests also presented its own minor challenges. The dedicated can opener as we know it, the kind with a rotating wheel, was not always standard issue or particularly robust. You might find yourself wrestling with a tin using a heavy, lever-type opener, or even resorting to a sheath knife or a bayonet if things got desperate. The satisfying hiss of escaping air from a good tin was a small moment of triumph, while a dull thud or a suspicious silence could signal disappointment. One can imagine that a reliable can opener, much like a good pair of dry socks, would have been a highly prized possession, perhaps even requiring its own backup, just in case the primary one went on strike from overwork. Historians still argue whether the cumulative toxicological effects of lead solder in tinned goods, consumed over several years, had a measurable impact on the health and even the decision-making abilities of some expedition members. In the early days of canning, lead was often used to seal the seams of the cans, and small amounts could leach into the food. While this was becoming less common by the heroic age, some older stock or less reputable brands might still have posed a risk. It's a chilling thought that the very containers designed to preserve life might have been subtly undermining it. So, you're surrounded by stacks of these tins, a metallic library of meals. Each one a gamble, a small journey into the unknown. As you settle further into your own comfortable surroundings, imagine that faint, metallic tang in the air, the anticipation, the occasional disappointment, the sheer, unadulterated joy of a good tin that tastes something like the food it's supposed to be. It's a world away from tapping on a screen and having a gourmet meal arrive at your door, isn't it? You're sitting there in the hut, the faint metallic scent of an open tin still lingering in the air, perhaps a smear of condensed milk, that sweet, sticky nectar we just talked about, still on your spoon. What do you do with such treasures? Well, more often than not, they found their way into a steaming mug, transforming a simple drink into a moment of genuine comfort, a brief, warm respite from the biting cold that was your constant companion. In the Antarctic, a hot beverage wasn't just a pleasantry. It was a lifeline, a source of internal warmth, a ritual that reminded you of a world far, far away. Tea, of course, was king, especially on British-led expeditions. It's a mainstream historical fact that vast quantities of tea were considered an absolutely non-negotiable part of the provisions. We're talking chests full of it. It was more than just a drink. It was a cultural touchstone, a punctuation mark in the long, monotonous sentences of polar days. You'd start your day with tea. You'd have tea with your midday meal, if you were lucky enough to be in the hut, and you'd certainly have tea in the evening. Lost a mitten? Have some tea. Developing frostbite? Definitely tea. Pretty sure that Penguin is judging your haircut? Tea will sort it out. The brew itself was likely a strong, dark Indian tea, the kind that could put hairs on your chest, or at least melt a small icicle at 20 paces. You'd imagine it brewed dark and potent, perhaps strong enough to stand a spoon up in, and possibly even dissolve the spoon if left unattended for too long. The ritual of making tea, even under the most trying circumstances, was important. Out on a sledge journey, the Primus stove, roaring like a tiny jet engine, and just as temperamental, as we'll discover when we talk about fuel, would be fired up. Snow or ice would be painstakingly melted down, a slow process that consumed precious fuel, just to get water. Then, the tea leaves would go in, brewing up a dark, fragrant liquid that, when sweetened with a lump of sugar and perhaps a splash of that tinned milk, felt like the very essence of civilization in your gloved hands. The warmth seeping through your mitts, the steam caressing your cold-chapped face. These small sensations were disproportionately comforting. Then there was cocoa. If tea was the reliable workhorse, cocoa was the comforting indulgence. Often reserved for the evenings, or as a special treat, cocoa was richer, more calorific, and felt distinctly more luxurious. Made with cocoa powder, sugar, and again, that essential tinned milk. It was a thick, sweet, chocolatey brew that could soothe frayed nerves and provide a welcome burst of energy before turning in for a cold night in your sleeping bag. You can almost taste it now, can't you? That deep, satisfying, almost fudgy warmth spreading through you, a stark contrast to the icy drafts whistling outside the hut walls. For men starved of sweet things and comfort, a mug of hot cocoa was a little mugful of morale. Coffee seems to have been less of a headline act on many of the British expeditions compared to its dominant cousin, tea, though it certainly featured on American and Scandinavian ventures. Where it was present, its stimulating properties would have been valued, especially during long, dark winter months or before a particularly arduous day of sledging. But for the most part, in the British Antarctic narrative, tea held the steaming, caffeinated crown. And then there was alcohol. The carefully guarded bottles of brandy, rum, or whiskey, usually stowed away under the quartermaster's or the doctor's watchful eye. Alcohol in the Antarctic was a complicated character. On the one hand, it was a powerful morale booster. A small tot of rum, served out on special occasions like Christmas Day, Midwinter's Day, a birthday, or the successful reaching of a significant geographical objective, was a moment of shared celebration, a brief, fiery warmth that spread cheer and camaraderie. The tradition of splicing the main brace, an old naval term for issuing an extra ration of rum, found its way onto the ice, a link to maritime heritage. You might find yourself raising a small, chipped enamel mug with your companions, the harsh spirit momentarily chasing away the chill and the gloom. It was also considered a medicinal supply. Brandy, in particular, was often administered in small doses as a reviver to men suffering from extreme cold, exhaustion, or shock. Whether it did any real physiological good in such circumstances is debatable, but the psychological effect, the feeling that something was being done, could be potent. Of course, there was always the temptation for a bit of self-prescription for ailments such as feeling a bit Monday-ish on a Thursday or suffering from an acute case of penguin-induced ennui. However, alcohol was also a double-edged sword. While it creates a fleeting sensation of warmth as blood vessels dilate, this vasodilation can actually lead to increased heat loss from the body's core, a dangerous proposition in sub-zero temperatures. Furthermore, impaired judgment from alcohol, even a small amount, could have catastrophic consequences when navigating treacherous crevassed terrain or operating vital equipment. And let's not forget the simple, practical problem that alcohol, if not strong enough or if left exposed, could freeze solid, becoming a rather unhelpful block of icy disappointment. A quirky tidbit often found in expedition memoirs revolves around the preciousness of these hot drinks and the disasters that could befall them. Imagine the collective groan if a clumsy movement sent the day's painstakingly brewed pot of tea cascading onto the icy floor, or if a Primus stove flared up unexpectedly, coating everything with a fine layer of soot just as the water was about to boil for the evening cocoa. These weren't just spills, they were minor tragedies, impacting both physical comfort and carefully hoarded supplies. There's one account of a particularly prized private stash of Earl Grey tea, brought by an officer, that was accidentally used by the cook for general consumption, leading to a very stiff upper lip and, one imagines, some quietly muttered imprecations. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of the alcohol ration for morale outweighed the potential physiological detriments and risks of impaired judgment in critical situations. Some leaders were very sparing with it, others more generous, and the outcomes are, as always, complex and multi-causal. It's one of those delicate balancing acts, the human need for comfort and release versus the unforgiving demands of the environment. So, as the wind howls its mournful song outside your imaginary hut, you clutch your warm mug. Whether it's filled with strong, sweet tea, rich cocoa, or even a cheeky, carefully measured splash of something stronger, it's a small anchor in a vast, indifferent world. It's a taste of routine, a flicker of warmth, a moment to gather your thoughts before facing whatever the ice has in store for you next. You're cradling that warm mug of heavily sweetened tea or cocoa we were just imagining, the sugary liquid a welcome caress against the chill. That sweetness, that delightful hit of sucrose, wasn't just a pleasant addition. It was a vital component of your Antarctic survival toolkit, both for your body and, perhaps even more importantly, for your mind. In a landscape so devoid of natural sweetness, where your diet consisted largely of fats, proteins, and very hard carbohydrates, the craving for sugar could become an almost primal urge. So, let's delve into the world of sweet provisions, the sugary fuel that helped keep those early 20th century explorers going. First and foremost, there was sugar itself, good old granulated sugar, or sometimes sugar cubes or blocks of loaf sugar. It's a mainstream historical fact that substantial quantities of sugar were packed for these expeditions, recognized for its straightforward caloric punch and its undeniable impact on morale. You can imagine it stored in large sacks or tins, a precious white gold that was carefully rationed. Every spoonful into your tea, every sprinkle on a rare porridge, was a calculated deposit into your energy bank. Given the immense physical exertion of man-hauling sledges through deep snow and biting winds, quick-burning carbohydrates like sugar were not just a luxury, but a physiological necessity. You might find yourself looking at a sugar cube with the same reverence some people reserve for actual gold nuggets. Beyond basic sugar, the explorers had access to more luxurious, if still simply packaged, forms of sweetness. Tins of jam and marmalade were highly prized. Imagine, if you will, the sheer, unadulterated joy of prying open a tin of strawberry jam or a pot of tangy orange marmalade in the middle of a bleak Antarctic winter. The aroma alone, a faint, ghostly echo of summer orchards and breakfast tables back home, would be enough to lift the spirits. You'd carefully spread a layer onto one of those unyielding ship's biscuits, transforming it from a dental challenge into something approaching a treat. That small smear of fruity sweetness was a direct link to a world of color and flavor, a vibrant contrast to the monochrome landscape outside and the often monotonous rations. Finding an intact, well-preserved tin of your favorite jam must have felt like discovering a winning lottery ticket, only significantly stickier and probably harder to open. Then there was golden syrup, or treacle, often transported in large, sometimes slightly battered tins. This thick, amber-colored elixir was another potent source of concentrated sugar. Its very stickiness seemed comforting, a slow, sweet ooze that could be drizzled over bannock, mixed into a rudimentary pudding if the cook was feeling ambitious, or, let's be honest, probably licked straight off the spoon when no one was looking. You can almost feel that satisfyingly heavy, sweet glop on your tongue, a brief, intense burst of pure sugary energy. It was the kind of sweetness that stuck with you, quite literally. And what about actual sweets, confectionery? While not a standard ration issued in vast quantities like sugar or jam, boiled sweets, toffees, and chocolate were often included, either as official treats for special occasions or as part of the men's personal supplies. A single, hard, fruit-flavored boiled sweet could be a small miracle on a long, grueling sledge journey. You'd let it dissolve slowly in your mouth, savoring every last vestige of its artificial fruitiness, a tiny explosion of flavor that momentarily distracted from the aching muscles and the frozen toes. These weren't just candy. They were miniature morale boosters, carefully hoarded and sometimes, one imagines, guarded more fiercely than state secrets. Chocolate, too, with its combination of sugar and fat, was both a comfort food and a valuable source of energy, though its tendency to become incredibly hard and brittle in the cold meant it might require some serious gnawing. You can imagine the hierarchy of desire. Basic sugar was good, jam was better, a piece of chocolate or a boiled sweet was practically divine intervention. The psychological impact of these sweet items was immense. In an environment that constantly tested your physical and mental limits, these small, sugary comforts provided moments of normalcy, of simple, uncomplicated pleasure. They were a reminder that life wasn't solely about enduring hardship. They were, in their own small way, a taste of hope. In the Antarctic, sugar wasn't just a condiment. It was practically its own food group, a cornerstone of the making life slightly less unbearable diet. Of course, storing these sweet treasures wasn't without its challenges. Sugar, being hygroscopic, had a frustrating tendency to absorb any available moisture from the air or leaky packaging, transforming from fine granules into a solid, impenetrable block that required chipping away at with the same determination usually reserved for Antarctic ice. Tins of jam, if damaged or improperly sealed, could ferment, leading to a rather alarming, fizzy, and distinctly alcoholic surprise upon opening. Not always an unwelcome one, perhaps, but certainly unexpected. And a leaking tin of golden syrup in your sledge box? That was a special kind of sticky catastrophe that could cement your spare socks, your mittens, and your general good humor together in one unfortunate, sugary conglomerate. A quirky tidbit that surfaces in some expedition diaries is the occasional, almost desperate attempt by the men to create their own sweet concoctions from the limited ingredients at hand. Imagine someone trying to whip up a birthday cake, using crushed biscuits, condensed milk, a bit of cocoa powder, and a lot of hope, perhaps decorated with carefully arranged sugar lumps. These culinary improvisations, however rustic, speak volumes about the human need for celebration and sweetness, even at the ends of the earth. Historians still argue whether the disproportionate amount of sugar and sweet preserves in some expedition diets, while good for immediate energy and morale, may have contributed to longer-term nutritional imbalances or even dental issues, though the latter was rarely documented as a primary concern amidst more pressing survival challenges like scurvy or frostbite. When you're trying not to freeze to death or starve, the long-term effects of your sugar intake tend to fall rather low on your list of worries. It was all about getting through the next hour, the next day, the next blizzard. So, as you nestle into your pillows, let your mind drift to those small, sweet moments of respite in the vast, frozen south. The clink of a spoon against a sugar bowl, the careful unwrapping of a precious sweet, the shared delight of a jam-covered biscuit. These weren't just trivialities. They were tiny sparks of warmth and joy, essential fuel for the human spirit in its struggle against the overwhelming, indifferent cold. You're basking in the imagined afterglow of that sugary treat, that little burst of sweetness that momentarily cut through the Antarctic chill. But while sugar provides quick fuel, a rapid flash in the energy pan, surviving, truly thriving, if one could even use such a word in that context. In the relentless, energy-sapping cold of the polar regions required something far more substantial, something that packed a much heavier caloric punch. And that, my sleepy friend, is where fat, in its various glorious and sometimes greasy forms, takes center stage. You'll recall our discussion about pemmican and its high fat content. Now, let's consider the other dedicated sources of this vital nutrient that were lugged, with great effort, to the bottom of the world. It's a simple, unglamorous truth of polar survival. Fat is king. It's a mainstream historical fact that fat provides more than double the calories per gram compared to either carbohydrates or proteins. When your body is fighting a constant, losing battle against temperatures that can freeze exposed skin in seconds, it becomes an insatiable furnace, burning through calories at an astonishing rate simply to maintain its core temperature. You needed to shovel fuel into that furnace, and fat was the most concentrated, efficient fuel available. Think of it as the high-octane stuff, the premium blend for your internal engine. Butter was a highly prized provision, though the Antarctic version bore little resemblance to the fresh, creamy pats you might spread on your morning toast. It was usually heavily salted to aid preservation and packed into tins. After months of storage, and the temperature yo-yos of a sea voyage followed by the deep freeze, this tinned butter could be an adventure. Sometimes it was perfectly acceptable, a welcome addition to a dry biscuit, or a dollop melted into your hush to add richness, and, more importantly, those precious calories. Other times, it might have separated, becoming oily and a bit watery, or developed a distinctly cheesy, almost tangy flavor that let you know it had been on a long journey of self-discovery. But even then, even when its quality was questionable, it was fat, and fat was energy. You'd scrape the tin with a kind of reverent desperation, grateful for every greasy smear. You might joke that a particularly good tin of butter was guarded more fiercely than the expedition's chronometers, or at least warranted a very stern, proprietary look from the cook if you lingered near it for too long. Then there was lard, the rendered fat of pigs. If butter was the slightly more refined cousin, lard was the no-nonsense, hard-working member of the fat family. It was almost pure fat, a dense, white, waxy substance that came in large tins or blocks. Its primary role was in cooking. You'd use it to fry your bannock if you were attempting such culinary feats, or add generous lumps to stews and pemmican hush to significantly boost the calorie count. On particularly lean days, or when men were ravenous after a brutal sledging shift, small amounts might even be eaten neat, a rather grim prospect to our modern sensibilities, akin to an extreme eating challenge, but with the very real consequence of freezing if you didn't get enough calories. The taste would have been blandly fatty, the texture waxy and cloying. But again, it was all about the energy density. Suet, the hard fat from around the kidneys of cattle or sheep, also made its way south. Often dried and shredded, it was a key ingredient in traditional British puddings, and yes, even in Antarctica, attempts were made to recreate a semblance of these comforting dishes, especially for celebrations like Christmas. A suet-heavy plum pudding, steamed for hours over a blubber stove, would have been a dense, caloric bomb, a welcome change from the usual fare and a significant morale booster, redolent with the ghosts of festive dinners past. Smaller amounts of suet might also be added to other dishes or even incorporated into homemade pemmican recipes to up the fat content. You might also find other, less common, fatty provisions. Perhaps a small quantity of olive oil, though this was less typical for British expeditions of the time. More likely, and certainly more memorable, would be something like cod liver oil. While primarily valued for its then misunderstood but clearly beneficial properties in staving off conditions like rickets, thanks to vitamins A and D, it is also, fundamentally, an oil of fat. The taste, as anyone who has ever been forced to consume it can attest, is legendarily unpleasant. But in the Antarctic, if it offered calories and some perceived health benefit, you might just hold your nose and swallow. It's a testament to the harsh realities that something so notoriously vile could be considered a valuable provision. This high-fat diet was believed to provide an internal overcoat, not just by supplying fuel for the body to burn for warmth, but also by, in theory, helping the men lay down a thin layer of subcutaneous fat as insulation. Whether this actually worked to any significant degree in such extreme conditions is debatable, but it was part of the prevailing wisdom. Every mouthful of greasy food was a small act of defiance against the cold. You might find, after a few months on this diet, that everything, your clothes, your sleeping bag, even your beard, carried the faint, lingering aroma of cooked fat, a constant reminder of your primary fuel source. Of course, relying so heavily on fats came with its own set of challenges. Rancidity was the ever-present enemy. Without reliable refrigeration, fats could easily spoil, especially if tins were compromised or if the fats themselves weren't perfectly rendered and preserved. Rancid fat not only tastes appalling, a sharp, acrid, almost metallic flavor, but it can also cause severe digestive upset, the last thing you need when you're hundreds of miles from the nearest rudimentary toilet, let alone medical assistance. There was also the issue of digestibility. While your body craved the calories, consuming very large quantities of fat, especially if it was old or rancid, could be tough on the system. A quirky tidbit you might stumble upon in expedition logs is an account of a butter disaster. Perhaps a whole crate of precious tin butter found to be completely rancid upon arrival, or a sledge accident that sent tins of lard tumbling into an inaccessible crevasse. Such losses would have been keenly felt. Conversely, the discovery of a forgotten, perfectly preserved cache of butter or lard would have been cause for genuine celebration, a gift from the provisioning gods. Medical historians and nutritionists still debate the optimal fat-to-protein to carbohydrate ratio for extreme cold endurance, and whether the specific types of fats available to early expeditions, often heavily saturated animal fats, were always the most beneficial for long-term health and performance compared to, say, the unsaturated fats more common in some traditional Arctic diets. But these were men operating on the best knowledge they had, in conditions that pushed human physiology to its absolute limits. They weren't thinking about their cholesterol levels 50 years down the line. They were thinking about surviving the next blizzard, the next crevasse, the next long, dark night. So, as you sink deeper into your own comfortable warmth, imagine that constant, gnawing need for calories, that almost obsessive focus on the fattiest, greasiest parts of your rations. It wasn't about gourmet dining. It was about stoking the fire within, about finding the densest possible fuel to keep your own small flame alive in the face of overwhelming, elemental cold. You've just mentally waded through a landscape of tinned butter, lard, and various other imported fats, all crucial for that inner furnace we talked about. But even the most calorie-dense, scientifically balanced imported ration eventually pales in comparison to something fresh. Your body, after months of preserved foods, starts to send out rather insistent signals, a deep-seated craving not just for different flavors, but for the very essence of recently living sustenance. And in the vast, frozen desert of Antarctica, freshly sourced meant turning your gaze and your hunting implements towards the local wildlife. Now, this wasn't a matter of sport or leisurely hunting as you might imagine it elsewhere. This was often a grim necessity, a vital means of supplementing dwindling supplies, providing a crucial change from the monotonous diet of tins and biscuits, and most importantly, a way to obtain those elusive anti-scorbutic properties that fresh meat was known, or at least strongly suspected, to possess. The two primary candidates for your Antarctic larder, waddling or lounging conveniently nearby, sometimes too conveniently for their own good, were penguins and seals. Let's start with the seals. Several species inhabit Antarctic waters, but the Weddell seal, with its rather placid nature and tendency to lie out on the sea ice near its breathing holes, was a frequent target. Crab-eater seals, too, despite their name, mostly eat krill and were also part of the unwilling menu. Hunting them was a stark business. Often, it involved a party of men venturing out onto the ice, armed with rifles, or, more commonly for seals already on the ice, heavy clubs or ice axes. It's a brutal image, and one that many of the men, even a century ago, found distasteful, but the alternative, slow decline from scurvy or starvation, was far grimmer. It's a mainstream historical fact that seal meat and blubber were absolutely vital resources for many expeditions, serving as food for both men and their dogs, and the blubber providing an excellent, if smoky, fuel source, which we'll get to later. The seals, you might say, didn't exactly volunteer for the stew pot, but their contribution was immense. Once a seal was dispatched, the real work began. It would be skinned and butchered on the ice, a cold and bloody task. The meat, dark red and rich, was a prized asset. Its taste was often described as strongly flavored, somewhat oily, and with a distinct fishy tang, not entirely surprising given their diet. It was certainly an acquired taste, and one that some explorers never fully, acquired. But it was fresh protein, and when cooked up, often stewed for a long time to make it tender, it was a welcome change from the endless tins. The blubber, a thick layer of fat beneath the skin, was carefully harvested, as valuable as the meat, if not more so for its fuel potential. Then there were the penguins. Adelie penguins, with their dapper black and white dinner jackets and comical, inquisitive nature, were abundant in coastal rookeries during the breeding season. Emperor penguins, larger and more majestic, were also sometimes taken. Hunting penguins, particularly Adelies in a crowded colony, was often depressingly easy. They were flightless, curious, and had little fear of humans on land. This made the act of killing them, usually with a club, particularly poignant for some of the more sensitive members of the expeditions. You can imagine the scene. These charming, almost cartoonish birds, waddling about their business one moment, and part of the expedition's provisions the next. Penguin meat was, if anything, even more strongly flavored than seal. Descriptions vary, but it was generally considered very dark, oily, and possessed an even more pronounced fishy or guano-like taste that could be challenging, to put it mildly. One explorer famously noted that it was like beef, odoriferous codfish, and canvasback duck roasted together in a pot, with a touch of pigsty seasoning. You might say every mouthful was a bit of a surprise, and not always the good kind. The breast meat was usually considered the best part, while the oilier portions were often reserved for the dogs or the blubber stove. Penguin eggs, however, if found in season, were a different story. Large, rich, and highly nutritious, they were considered a delicacy, eagerly sought after for a taste of something genuinely fresh and less challenging than the adult birds. The most critical aspect of consuming this fresh meat, beyond the calories and variety, was its role in preventing scurvy. Even if the precise science of vitamin C was still being unraveled, the empirical evidence was clear. Men who ate fresh meat regularly did not succumb to the debilitating effects of scurvy. The difference could be dramatic, with listless, ailing men regaining their strength and vigor after a few days on a diet of fresh seal or penguin. It was a powerful motivator to overcome any squeamishness about the hunt or the taste. Preparing these local delicacies was an art form born of necessity. Long, slow stewing was common, often with any available flavorings, like a precious onion or some hoarded herbs, thrown in to try and temper the more aggressive notes of the meat. Sometimes, steaks might be fried in seal blubber, a truly Antarctic surf and turf. The smell of seal or penguin cooking in the hut would have been distinctive. A rich, oily, slightly fishy aroma that would either whet your appetite with the promise of fresh food or make you long for a simple, predictable tin of bully beef. A quirky tidbit you might encounter in the tales of these expeditions is the occasional story of a pet penguin, perhaps one that hung around the hut, spared from the pot due to its particularly endearing antics or a sentimental attachment from one of the men. These stories, whether entirely true or embellished over time, highlight the complex relationship between the explorers and the wildlife they depended upon, a mixture of respect, necessity, and sometimes a flicker of affection in a world otherwise devoid of gentle creatures. Historians and biologists still debate the long-term ecological impact of early Antarctic hunting by expeditions, though localized, on specific seal and penguin populations, particularly before any protective measures were even conceived. While the numbers taken by individual expeditions were likely small in the grand scheme of vast Antarctic populations, the targeting of breeding colonies could have had more significant local effects. It's a reminder that even these early forays into the wilderness were not without their environmental footprint. So, As you drift into a state of deeper relaxation, imagine the stark contrast. The months of preserved, unchanging rations, and then the sudden, visceral reality of the hunt, the butchering, and the consumption of fresh, wild meat. It was a primal cycle of survival played out on the ice, a testament to the lengths you'd go to, the compromises you'd make, to keep body and soul together at the very end of the earth. The taste might be strong, the methods grim, but that fresh mouthful was a taste of life itself. You've just contemplated the grim necessity of the Antarctic hunt, the life-giving properties of fresh seal and penguin meat that we touched upon in our last chat. And a significant part of that life-giving quality, beyond just calories and protein, was its power against a truly terrifying and insidious foe, a specter that haunted every long voyage and isolated outpost of that era, scurvy. Its very name was whispered with a kind of dread, a creeping malaise that could unravel the strongest man and cripple an entire expedition. Imagine, if you will, a slow, unwelcome transformation. It might start with a profound weariness, a lethargy that seeps into your bones, making every movement an effort. Then, your gums might begin to feel tender, becoming swollen, spongy, and eventually bleeding at the slightest touch. Your teeth, those precious tools for tackling the ship's biscuits we talked about, might start to loosen in their sockets. Old wounds, long since healed, could mysteriously reopen as if the body's repair mechanisms were simply giving up. Your joints would ache, your skin might develop strange, dark blotches, and your breath would become unpleasant. It wasn't just a physical decay. It was a profound sapping of the will, a descent into weakness and misery. The list of symptoms, you might grimly joke, was probably longer than the expedition's original manifest for hopeful outcomes. Now, here's the truly frustrating part for those early 20th century explorers. While the connection between a lack of fresh food and the onset of scurvy was often observed, the exact scientific reason, a deficiency of ascorbic acid or vitamin C, wasn't fully understood or universally accepted by all. It's a mainstream historical fact that as far back as the mid-18th century, Dr. James Lind had demonstrated that citrus fruits could cure scurvy. Yet, this vital knowledge often got lost in translation, muddled by conflicting theories, or was deemed impractical to implement on such long and arduous journeys before the advent of reliable vitamin preservation. This gap in understanding led to a proliferation of misguided theories and some truly desperate, often ineffective, attempts at prevention and cure. Some believe scurvy was a form of ptomaine poisoning, caused by tainted tinned meats. This theory, while understandably arising from the sometimes questionable quality of canned goods we've discussed, directed prevention efforts down the wrong path. Others thought it was due to a lack of fresh air in crowded ship's quarters or damp huts, or insufficient exercise. All things that could certainly contribute to general ill health, but weren't the specific villain in scurvy's story. As a result, expedition medical kits might be stocked with an array of supposed anti-scorbutics that range from the vaguely plausible to the utterly bizarre. You might find various tinctures and elixirs, special vinegars, or even regimens involving specific, often unappetizing, dietary exclusions or inclusions that entirely missed the mark. You can almost picture a hopeful, yet ultimately disappointed, explorer diligently consuming his daily dose of Dr. Higginbottom's patented ponderous powders, guaranteed to make you ponder why you took them, or some such equally unhelpful concoction. The tinned vegetables we discussed earlier, bless their mushy hearts, were often so heavily processed that any vitamin C they might have once possessed had long since waved a tiny white flag and surrendered. They wouldn't scare off a determined vitamin, let alone the full-blown horror of scurvy. The connection to fresh meat, especially seal meat, was a recurring theme, as we noted. Whalers and Arctic indigenous peoples had long known its protective value. On Antarctic expeditions that regularly consumed fresh seal, scurvy was often kept at bay or quickly resolved. But why it worked was still debated. Was it the freshness itself, some vital essence lost in preservation? Was it something in the blood? This empirical success, even without full scientific comprehension, made those grim hunts for seal and penguin not just about filling bellies, but about actively fighting off this invisible enemy. And what about the famous lime juice of the British Navy, The reason British sailors earned the nickname limeys? By the early 20th century, the provision of lime or lemon juice was standard practice on British ships. However, its effectiveness was notoriously variable. Sometimes, the juice was boiled during processing to preserve it, a practice which, unbeknownst to them, could destroy much of the fragile vitamin C. Other times, there might have been a switch from Mediterranean lemons, higher in vitamin C, to West Indian limes, lower in vitamin C but easier to source within the empire, further reducing its potency. A quirky tidbit from some accounts is the sheer unpalatability of some batches of this preserved juice, so acidic or unpleasant that men had to be practically forced to drink it, often mixed with sugar and rum, as grog, to make it bearable. And even then, its preservation on a multi-year Antarctic expedition, through freezing and thawing, was a significant challenge. When scurvy did begin to take hold in a camp, a palpable sense of fear and urgency would set in. The afflicted men would become increasingly weak, their suffering a grim reminder to their companions of what might await them. Desperate measures would be taken. Any remaining fresh supplies, like the few onions or potatoes carefully hoarded, would be prioritized for the sick. Frantic efforts might be made to hunt for more seals or penguins, if the season and location permitted. The psychological toll was immense, watching your comrades decline, feeling your own energy ebb away, all while surrounded by an environment that demanded peak physical fitness for survival. Nutrition historians still debate the exact reasons why the well-established 18th century knowledge about citrus fruits and scurvy was so inconsistently applied or even disregarded by some early 20th century polar expeditions, considering the devastating consequences. Was it logistical arrogance, flawed scientific understanding that prioritized other theories, or simply the immense difficulty of transporting and preserving effective antiscorbutics in the harsh polar environment? The answer is likely a complex mix of all these factors. So, as you lie there, feeling healthy and comfortable, take a moment to appreciate the intricate chemistry your body effortlessly maintains. Imagine the quiet dread of feeling that first unnatural sponginess in your gums, the first inexplicable ache in your limbs, knowing that you are thousands of miles from any hope of fresh fruit or vegetables. The fight against scurvy was a constant, often invisible battle waged within the very bodies of these explorers, a battle as critical as any they fought against the ice and storms. It underscores just how much of their survival depended not just on courage and endurance, but on the strange, and sometimes tragically flawed, contents of their provision boxes. You've just navigated the grim shadow of scurvy, that debilitating affliction that underscored the desperate need for fresh, often cooked, food in the Antarctic. And what does cooking invariably require, especially when your ingredients are frozen solid or need a long, slow stew to become even remotely palatable? That's right, fuel. We've alluded to it several times. Melting snow for those life-saving hot drinks, boiling up the pemmican hush, even the faint hope of baking a bannock. But now let's turn our full attention to this absolutely critical non-food provision. Because without fuel, your carefully curated stacks of tinned goods, your blocks of pemmican, even your freshly hunted seal meat, would be significantly less useful, and your chances of survival would plummet faster than a misplaced mitten in a crevasse. Fuel, in the context of an early 20th century Antarctic expedition, meant heat, and heat meant life. It meant hot food to energize weary bodies, melted snow and ice to provide essential drinking water. You can't just eat snow indefinitely without dangerously lowering your core temperature. And, if you were lucky enough to be in a base hut, a source of warmth to fight off the bone-deep, ever-present cold. Running out of biscuits would be bad, running out of pemmican dire, but running out of fuel? That was arguably even scarier than running out of tea, which, as you know by now, is really saying something for a British-led expedition. The workhorse of imported fuel was paraffin, or kerosene as it's also known. This was the lifeblood of the small, portable Primus stoves that were a revolutionary piece of technology for explorers of the era. It's a mainstream historical fact that paraffin-fueled Primus stoves were standard equipment on most heroic age expeditions, prized for their efficiency in generating intense heat from a relatively small amount of fuel. You can imagine the scene. Tins upon tins of paraffin, carefully sealed, one hoped, to prevent leakage during the rough voyage south, and the subsequent manhandling onto the ice. Each tin represented a certain number of hot meals, a certain quantity of drinking water, a certain period of reprieve from the cold. These Primus stoves, often made of brass, were marvels of engineering for their time, but they could also be famously temperamental. You couldn't just flick a switch. They required a ritual, preheating with a splash of methylated spirits, pumping vigorously to build up pressure, and carefully pricking the jet with a tiny needle if it became clogged, which it frequently did. They had more personality, and arguably more tantrums, than some of the quieter expedition members. But when a Primus was running well, its loud, continuous roar was a comforting sound, a miniature sun battling the Antarctic gloom, a beacon of warmth in a tent or a corner of the hut, upon which so much depended. For the main base hut, if the expedition was substantial and planned for a long stay, coal was often the fuel of choice for heating. Sacks of coal, heavy and dirty, would be laboriously unloaded from the ship and stacked near the hut. A cast iron stove, stoked with coal, could provide a more consistent and widespread warmth than the smaller cooking stoves, making the hut a relative haven. The sight of smoke curling from the hut's chimney, the faint glow of the stove visible through a small window, would have been an incredibly welcoming beacon in that vast, white desolation. Of course, hauling those heavy sacks across the ice was no small feat, another testament to the sheer physical labor involved in just existing there. But what happened if the imported paraffin ran low, or if the coal supply was exhausted or inaccessible? This is where the resourcefulness of the explorers and the unfortunate local wildlife we discussed in Section 8 came into play again. Seal blubber, and to a lesser extent penguin blubber, proved to be an excellent, if rather fragrant, alternative fuel source. The thick layers of fat from these animals, when rendered down or even just cut into strips and fed into a specially adapted stove, burned with a very hot, albeit incredibly smoky and sooty, flame. Makeshift blubber stoves were often fashioned from old oil drums or other metal containers. You can picture the scene. Men huddled around this sputtering, greasy flame, the air thick with oily smoke, everything gradually acquiring a fine patina of black, sticky soot. The smell of burning blubber was unique. An acquired aroma, you might say, much like a skunk's perfume, only significantly greasier and more inclined to cling to your clothing for weeks. But it was hot, and it was free, in terms of monetary cost, if not in terms of effort and the lives of the seals or penguins. This ability to live off the land, even for something as basic as fuel, could make the difference between relative comfort and extreme hardship, or even survival and disaster. Wood, as you might imagine in the treeless expanse of Antarctica, was an incredibly scarce and precious commodity. Any scrap of wood from the construction of the hut, from broken packing crates, old sledge runners, or even pieces of the ship itself deemed expendable, would be hoarded like treasure and burned with extreme parsimony. It offered a cleaner flame than blubber, a more familiar scent of home, but it was a finite resource that vanished all too quickly. The consumption of fuel was a constant source of anxiety and meticulous calculation. Every cup of water melted, every meal cooked, represented a quantifiable depletion of this vital resource. Strict rationing was often necessary, especially on long sledge journeys where every ounce of paraffin counted. Imagine the frustration of a malfunctioning stove that wasted precious fuel, or the difficult decision to forego a hot meal to conserve supplies for melting drinking water. These were the daily calculations that governed life. And fuel, like many essential things, came with its own dangers. The risk of fire in a wooden hut, filled with flammable bedding, clothing, and potentially leaking paraffin, was a constant nightmare. A dropped candle, an overturned Primus stove, a spark from the coal stove. Any of these could lead to catastrophe in minutes, with nowhere to escape but out into the lethal cold. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated stoves was another silent threat, especially in small, snowbank tents. And spilled paraffin could ruin food supplies or saturate clothing, rendering it dangerously cold and clammy. A quirky tidbit you might find in expedition diaries is an account of a blubber stove explosion. Not necessarily a dramatic detonation, but perhaps a sudden flare-up of oily flames that sent men scrambling and coated the entire hut interior and its occupants in an extra thick layer of greasy soot, leading to days of miserable cleaning and a lingering aroma that would make even the dogs wrinkle their noses. Such an event would be a darkly comic episode in an otherwise trying existence. Historians and engineers still debate the true efficiency and reliability of early Primus stove designs under extreme Antarctic conditions versus contemporary accounts, particularly concerning fuel consumption rates and susceptibility to jet clogging with impure paraffin often supplied. Were they the miracle devices some claimed, or did their flaws contribute to the hardships faced? The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in between, dependent on the quality of the specific stove, the purity of the fuel, and the skill of the operator. So, as the idea of warmth cocoons you, think of that relentless quest for heat in a land of perpetual cold. The roar of the Primus, the smoky flicker of a blubber lamp, the comforting glow of a coal stove. These were the beating hearts of the expedition, the fires around which life, quite literally, revolved. Without them, the Antarctic would have remained not just unexplored, but truly uninhabitable. You've warmed your imaginary hands over a sputtering blubber stove, felt the comforting roar of a Primus, and appreciated the sheer life-or-death importance of fuel in that frozen world. But all the external heat sources in Antarctica couldn't fully protect you when you stepped out of the hut or tent and into the face of a raging blizzard, or even just a typically crisp Antarctic Tuesday with a -40-degree wind chill. For that, you needed your own personal, wearable heating system, your clothing. And let me tell you, getting dressed for an Antarctic outing in the early 1900s was a far cry from slipping on a modern lightweight Gore-Tex parka and some thermal fleece. It was a serious, multi-layered engineering project every single time. The challenges were immense. You needed protection from extreme cold, obviously, but also from the relentless, soul-sapping wind that could strip heat from your body with terrifying efficiency. Your clothing had to be durable enough to withstand months, even years, of hard wear and tear. And, crucially, it needed to be breathable, or at least designed in such a way that moisture from your sweat could escape. If your inner layers got soaked with perspiration during heavy exertion, like man-hauling a sledge, that dampness would freeze solid the moment you stopped moving, effectively encasing you in a personal ice pack, a fast track to hypothermia. The solution, then as now to some extent, lay in layering. Lots and lots of layers. You wouldn't just put on a single, super thick coat. Instead, you'd build up your defenses like an onion, or perhaps more accurately, like the Michelin Man's great-grandfather. It's a mainstream historical fact that wool was the absolute king of insulating materials for these expeditions. Its natural crimp creates tiny air pockets that trap warmth, and remarkably, it retains a good portion of its insulating properties even when damp. So, your first line of defense, right against your skin, would be woolen underwear. Long johns and long-sleeved vests, probably not of the soft, merino variety you might find today. This was old-school wool, often coarse and relentlessly itchy. You might joke that the constant, low-grade scratching it induced provided its own form of central heating. Over this, you'd pile on more wool. Woolen shirts, thick, heavy sweaters, perhaps even a knitted woolen balaclava pulled down over your head and neck. Some expeditions incorporated sheepskin, with the fleece turned inwards for jackets or vests, offering incredible warmth but also considerable bulk. Fur, particularly wolf or reindeer fur for ruffs around hoods, was highly prized because it doesn't frost up as easily from your breath as other materials, preventing that dreaded ice beard to hood freezing solid scenario. The outermost layer was all about defeating the wind. This typically consisted of garments made from tightly woven cotton canvas or gabardine, a fabric famously championed by Burberry and used to great effect by explorers like Amundsen. This windproof shell, an anorak or parka with a hood, and matching trousers or overalls, was designed to be relatively loose-fitting to accommodate all those insulating layers underneath and to allow for some air circulation. When it got truly cold and damp, this outer layer could freeze to the consistency of sheet metal, making movement a rather stiff and crackly affair. You'd sound like a walking packet of crisps if crisps were made of ice. Protecting your extremities was a constant battle. For your head, on top of the balaclava, you'd have a fur-lined hat with generous ear flaps that could be tied down. Goggles were essential, not just to prevent snow blindness from the unrelenting glare off the ice, but also to protect your eyes from stinging, wind-driven snow and to stop your eyelashes from freezing together, which, as you can imagine, is rather inconvenient. Your hands would be swaddled in multiple layers too. Thin woolen gloves might be worn for tasks requiring dexterity, if you could bear the cold for that long. But for serious warmth, it was all about mittens. Several pairs of woolen mittens, one inside the other, all encased in a larger, windproof outer mitt. This system trapped more warm air than gloves and kept your fingers together for shared warmth. Of course, trying to operate a camera, adjust a ski binding, or prick a Primus jet while wearing what felt like a pair of boxing gloves on each hand was a masterclass in frustration. Frostbitten fingers were a common and painful reminder of any lapse in vigilance. Footwear was equally complex and critical. You'd start with several pairs of thick woolen socks. Then came the boots. Some expeditions relied on heavy leather ski boots or hobnailed marching boots, often made much larger than usual to accommodate all those socks. The problem with leather, however, is that it can absorb moisture, freeze solid, and become incredibly unforgiving, leading to chafing and frostbite. A more specialized and often superior option, particularly favored by Scandinavian explorers like Amundsen who learned from indigenous Arctic peoples, was the Finsko, a boot made from reindeer skin, worn with the fur side out or in, and often insulated with sennegrass. This dried grass would be carefully arranged inside the boot each morning to absorb moisture and provide cushioning and insulation. Your socks, after a day of slogging through snow, could probably stand up on their own, not from starch, but from sheer frozen determination and accumulated perspiration. The absolute necessity of trying to keep these layers dry cannot be overstated. Every evening, in the hut or tent, a battle would ensue to dry out damp socks, mittens, and boot liners, often hung precariously close to the stove, risking scorching in the pursuit of dryness. It was a never-ending cycle. A quirky tidbit often found in expedition narratives is the almost ritualistic care taken over personal clothing items, or the surprising ingenuity shown in repairs. With no department stores around the corner, a torn windproof jacket or a hole in a woolen sock was a serious matter. Everyone had to become proficient with a needle and thread. Some men even became quite attached to a particular patched-up sweater or a comfortably broken-in pair of boots, items that had seen them through so much. You might also read of an explorer who insisted on bringing a somewhat impractical item of civilian clothing, like a tweed jacket, for maintaining standards, only for it to prove utterly useless against the polar elements, but perhaps providing a small psychological comfort. Clothing historians and polar experts still debate the relative merits of different contemporary approaches to Antarctic attire. For instance, the Amundsen approach emphasizing lighter, looser, often fur-based layers adapted from Inuit designs, allowing for better moisture management, versus the heavier, multiple woolen layer system favored by some British expeditions, which could become incredibly cumbersome and prone to retaining moisture. Each system had its proponents and its drawbacks, and often, success came down to meticulous management and understanding the principles of heat retention and moisture control, regardless of the specific garments worn. So, as you snuggle under your modern, lightweight, and probably very soft duvet, spare a thought for those early explorers, methodically donning layer upon layer of itchy wool and stiff canvas. Feel the sheer bulk, the restriction of movement, the constant awareness of the battle between your body heat and the ravenous, biting cold just inches away. Their clothing was their first and last line of personal defense in a world that was actively trying to freeze them solid. You're all bundled up in your imaginary layers of wool and windproof canvas, a walking fortress against the Antarctic cold, as we discussed. But simply surviving, as monumental a task as that was, wasn't the sole purpose for many of these early 20th century expeditions. These men, or at least a significant portion of them, weren't just there to see if they could endure the hardship. They were driven by a thirst for knowledge, a desire to map the unknown, to understand the unique environment of this last uncharted continent. And to do that, they had to lug yet another category of essential, often heavy and delicate provisions onto their already overburdened sledges, the tools of discovery, their scientific instruments. Imagine the discussions, the careful balancing act. Every extra pound of scientific gear meant a pound less of food or fuel. Yet, without these instruments, the expedition might return with tales of endurance, but with little new understanding of the continent itself. So, amidst the pemmican tins and paraffin cans, you'd find an array of specialized equipment, each piece a fragile hope for wresting secrets from the ice. Meteorology was a key focus. You'd find meticulously packed barometers, both the robust aneroid types and the more precise, but incredibly fragile mercurial ones, their delicate glass tubes a constant source of anxiety. These were vital for measuring air pressure, which helped in the often wildly inaccurate art of weather forecasting and in determining altitude. Alongside them would be thermometers, mercury for general use, and spirit thermometers for temperatures below mercury's freezing point. Maximum and minimum thermometers would be set up to record the brutal temperature swings. Anemometers, with their spinning cups, were there to measure the ferocious wind speeds, and hygrometers to gauge the surprisingly low humidity of the polar air. You can picture a scientist, bundled to the eyeballs, diligently emerging from the hut at set intervals, his fingers stiff with cold, to read these instruments and painstakingly log the data in a notebook, his breath freezing on the page. Then there was the crucial work of geography and surveying. Theodolites, with their complex system of telescopes, spirit levels, and finely graduated circles, were essential for accurately measuring angles, the bedrock of mapmaking. Hauling one of these delicate, brass and glass instruments across a sastrugi-strewn ice field, and then trying to set it up and make precise readings in a howling wind with mittened hands, was an exercise in extreme patience and skill. It was a special kind of optimistic folly to even attempt it on some days. Sextants, too, were vital for celestial navigation, allowing the explorers to determine their latitude and, with the help of an accurate timepiece, their longitude, especially when venturing far from any known landmarks. And speaking of timepieces, the ship's chronometers, and often smaller pocket chronometers carried on sledge journeys, were among the most critical pieces of equipment. It's a mainstream historical fact that accurate chronometers were indispensable for navigation and surveying, as precise timekeeping is essential for calculating longitude. These weren't just ordinary watches. They were highly accurate, spring-driven mechanical timekeepers, often housed in gimbaled wooden boxes to protect them from shocks and temperature changes. They had to be wound religiously, kept as close to a stable temperature as possible, sometimes meaning a man would sleep with one to keep it from freezing, and their rates of error meticulously tracked. You might joke that the expedition's chief chronometer was probably more pampered and fussed over than some of the junior expedition members. Compasses, both magnetic and solar, were also on the list, though magnetic compasses became notoriously unreliable as one approached the south magnetic pole, making the sun compass, when the sun deigned to appear, a more dependable guide. Geology was another major scientific pursuit. You'd see the geologists heading out, armed with sturdy geological hammers, chisels, and a seemingly endless supply of canvas sample bags. Their eyes would be scanning the nunataks, those isolated mountain peaks protruding through the ice sheet, for exposed rock. Every new type of rock, every fossil found, and they did find fossils, providing crucial evidence of Antarctica's warmer past, was a thrilling discovery. Of course, these geological souvenirs tended to be rather heavy. One can almost hear a weary sledge hauler muttering as yet another 50 pounds rock sample was carefully labeled and added to the load. Honestly, Perkins, do you really need another big gray one? It's for science, you say? Right. Biological collection was also on the agenda, though Antarctica isn't exactly teeming with obvious life. Expeditions would carry nets and dredges for sampling marine life from the icy waters, small collecting jars, and bottles of preservative fluids like formalin or alcohol for preserving any unusual fish, crustaceans, or even algae. On land, they'd be searching for hardy mosses, lichens, and any tiny invertebrates that managed to eke out an existence in that extreme environment. And, of course, there were the cameras. The early 20th century was a time of great advances in photography, and these expeditions were keen to document their experiences and the landscapes they encountered. This usually meant large, heavy plate cameras, which used individual glass plate negatives rather than roll film. Imagine trying to load a fragile glass plate into a camera, focus with frozen bellows, and make an exposure, all while wearing bulky mittens in sub-zero temperatures. Then came the challenge of developing these plates, often in makeshift darkrooms set up in the hut, juggling trays of chemicals that were constantly threatening to freeze. Yet, the iconic, hauntingly beautiful images captured by photographers like Herbert Ponting with Scott or Frank Hurley with Mawson and Shackleton became some of the most enduring legacies of these expeditions, shaping our collective vision of Antarctica. Using any of these instruments in the extreme cold presented a host of problems. Metal parts became brittle and could snap unexpectedly. Lubricants and moving parts would freeze solid. Condensation would instantly fog lenses and eyepieces. Writing down observations was an ordeal, with graphite pencils being more reliable than ink, which would freeze. Fingers, even inside mittens, would quickly become too numb for delicate adjustments. A quirky tidbit that emerges from these accounts might be the story of a specific instrument that gained a personality, perhaps a notoriously fickle barometer that always seemed to predict the exact opposite of the coming weather, or a camera shutter that only worked if you sweet-talked it first. Or maybe an anecdote about an overly curious penguin attempting to assist with a meteorological reading by pecking inquisitively at a thermometer. Historians of science and polar exploration still debate the true scientific value and impact of some of the more rudimentary data collected on early expeditions, given the limitations of the instruments and methodologies, versus their immense symbolic and inspirational contributions to opening up the continent. Was every painstakingly recorded temperature reading, every slightly off-kilter survey measurement, a vital contribution, or was the greater value in simply being there, in proving it could be done, and in bringing back those first evocative images and rock samples? As you drift into a state of peaceful rest, picture those sledges, laden not just with the means of survival, but with these tools of inquiry. Feel the weight of those ambitions, the dedication of those individuals who, in the midst of an epic struggle against the elements, also sought to expand the boundaries of human knowledge, one frozen data point, one chipped rock sample, one precious photographic plate at a time. You've just mentally cataloged the array of scientific instruments, those precious tools of discovery that journeyed south, each one representing a hope for new knowledge. But alongside the barometers, theodolites, and cameras, another, equally vital, set of specialized provisions was carefully packed, the contents of the expedition's medicine chest. Because while the quest for scientific understanding was noble, the human body, that most intricate and often frustratingly fragile instrument of all, was constantly at risk in the brutal Antarctic environment. And when things went wrong, miles from the nearest hospital or even a friendly pharmacist, it was this chest and the expedition doctor that stood between a minor ailment and a major disaster. The expedition doctor, often a qualified surgeon, frequently doubled as a naturalist or another kind of scientist to earn his place on the voyage. But when illness or injury struck, his medical skills came to the forefront, and the weight of responsibility on his shoulders must have been immense. He was the sole guardian of the crew's physical well-being, armed only with his knowledge, his experience, and the carefully selected contents of that polar medicine chest. So, what kind of afflictions might you, as an early 20th century Antarctic explorer, present to your long-suffering doctor? Frostbite, of course, was a daily menace. From the initial painful tingling of frost nip on your nose or earlobes to the deeper, more insidious freeze that could turn your fingers and toes into insensible, waxy claws, it was a constant battle. Treatment was rudimentary, gradual rewarming, often with body heat, and a strict avoidance of rubbing the affected part with snow, a common but harmful old wives' tale. Then there was snow blindness, a searingly painful inflammation of the cornea caused by the relentless ultraviolet glare from the snow and ice. Even with protective goggles, it was a common complaint. The doctor might offer you cocaine eye drops. Yes, cocaine was a widely used local anesthetic back then, or perhaps a soothing solution of zinc sulfate. Physical injuries were an ever-present risk. A slip on the treacherous ice could result in a sprained ankle or a fractured limb. A moment's carelessness with a knife while cutting frozen pemmican or skinning a seal could lead to a nasty gash. Burns from a sputtering Primus stove or an overturned pot of boiling water were also hazards in the confined spaces of a hut or tent. And with any open wound, Infection was a terrifying prospect in an era before antibiotics. Digestive troubles, from the monotonous and often poorly preserved diet, were rife. Bouts of diarrhea, stubborn constipation, and general abdominal misery. And imagine the pure, unadulterated agony of a raging toothache, hundreds of miles from the nearest dentist. The expedition doctor would be equipped with a terrifying-looking set of dental forceps, and extraction was often the only, very final, solution. You might half-jokingly suggest the surgical kit looked like it was borrowed from a medieval dungeon, but you'd be desperately hoping it was at least a bit more sterile. Peeking into that medicine chest, you'd first find the basics: rolls of bandages, absorbent lint, gauze dressings, and adhesive plaster for patching up cuts and scrapes. Antiseptics were there in abundance, though often harsh by modern standards. Carbolic acid, boric acid, iodine, which would sting like fury, and potassium permanganate, used to create antiseptic solutions. Splints of various sizes would be ready for immobilizing broken bones. And yes, a basic surgical kit containing scalpels, forceps, clamps, needles, and sutures, often made from catgut, would be included. It's a mainstream historical fact that expedition medical kits contained these instruments for emergency procedures, underscoring the complete medical self-sufficiency required. The thought of undergoing surgery on a makeshift table in a freezing, dimly lit hut is enough to make you shiver for reasons beyond the cold. Then there were the potions and pills, the more potent remedies for pain and illness. For severe pain, the doctor had access to powerful opiates like laudanum, a tincture of opium, or morphine, usually in tablet or injectable form. These were incredibly effective painkillers, but also highly addictive and capable of suppressing respiration if overused, a dangerous tightrope for the doctor to walk. If the laudanum didn't cure your ailment, it would at least make you forget what was wrong in the first place, possibly along with your own name and the current location of Antarctica. As mentioned, cocaine, in various forms, was used not just for eye conditions, but also as a local anesthetic for minor surgical procedures or those dreaded dental extractions. You'd likely find quinine, a staple of colonial medicine chests, included for treating fevers. Though malaria wasn't an Antarctic concern, fevers from infections or other illnesses were. Aspirin, or acetylsalicylic acid, was a relatively newer wonder drug at the time, valued for its ability to reduce pain and fever. And for those common digestive complaints, a formidable arsenal of purgatives and emetics stood ready. Castor oil, the mere mention of which could make strong men quail. Epsom salts for a thorough internal cleansing, and perhaps even ipecacuanha to induce vomiting if something truly poisonous was suspected. The medical philosophy of the era often leaned towards heroic measures. If in doubt, purge it out. The solution to many ailments often seemed to be either a good dose of castor oil or try not to think about it too hard. You might also find an array of cough mixtures, tonics, and various liniments, some of which might contain rather surprising ingredients like alcohol, opiates, or even cannabis, their efficacy often more a matter of faith or mild intoxication than proven science. A quirky tidbit you might discover is the inclusion of a popular patent medicine of the day, perhaps a universal embrocation or miracle balm, that was optimistically labeled to cure everything from chilblains and sprains to indigestion and general listlessness. Its actual contents might be a mystery, but its presence offered a sliver of hope, or at least a target for some gentle sarcasm. The limitations of medicine in the early 20th century were stark. There were no antibiotics to combat infections, meaning even a small cut could become life-threatening. The understanding of many diseases was incomplete, and treatments were often aimed at alleviating symptoms rather than curing the underlying cause. The expedition doctor relied heavily on his diagnostic skills, his experience, and a good deal of patient resilience, not to mention a healthy dose of luck. Beyond just mending bodies, the doctor often played a crucial role in maintaining morale, acting as an unofficial counselor for men struggling with the psychological strains of isolation, darkness, and constant danger. Medical historians continue to analyze expedition logs and medical supply lists to assess the actual efficacy of treatments administered versus the natural resilience of the men, and to debate how often the heroic interventions of the era, such as aggressive purging or heavy opiate use, might have inadvertently complicated recovery or masked underlying issues. It's a complex picture viewed through the lens of rapidly evolving medical science. So, as you settle into your own state of well-being, imagine the contents of that polar medicine chest, a curious, slightly alarming, yet utterly vital collection of bottles, tins, and instruments. It represented the era's best attempt to hold illness and injury at bay, a fragile shield against the many ways a human body could falter in the most inhospitable place on Earth. You've just had a peek into that formidable polar medicine chest, a collection of remedies both wondrous and worrying, all designed to patch up the physical frame against the myriad assaults of the Antarctic. But keeping the body going was only half the battle, if that. The human mind, subjected to months of isolation, darkness, danger, and the sheer, grinding monotony of the polar environment, also needed its own set of provisions, its own carefully curated comforts. These weren't frivolous luxuries. They were essential tools for staving off the equally dangerous threats of despair, boredom, and the kind of mental weariness that could be just as crippling as any physical ailment. So, what did you, as an early 20th century explorer, have to look forward to when the day's grueling work was done, or during those long, sunless months of the polar winter? First and foremost, for many, there was tobacco. It's a mainstream historical fact that tobacco, in its various forms, pipes, cigarettes, and chewing tobacco, was a standard and highly valued part of the rations on most expeditions of this era. In a time when smoking was far more socially prevalent and its health risks less understood, a pipeful of tobacco or a hand-rolled cigarette was a moment of punctuation in a long day, a small ritual of relaxation, a companion in quiet contemplation, or a catalyst for conversation. You can almost smell that pungent, sweetish aroma of pipe smoke mingling with the scent of paraffin and cooking food in the confines of the hut, a familiar, if somewhat thick, atmosphere. The desperation when tobacco supplies began to dwindle was palpable in many expedition diaries, a testament to how much these men relied on its soothing, or at least distracting, properties. Then there were books. Even in the most Spartan of outpost huts, you'd likely find an expedition library, a collection of volumes carefully chosen to provide entertainment, instruction, and, above all, escape. Novels by popular authors of the day, poetry to stir the soul or provide a moment of reflection, scientific texts for those eager to learn, and travelogues detailing adventures in other, perhaps warmer, parts of the world. These books would be passed from hand to hand until their covers were worn and their pages softened with use, each one a portal to another reality. You might imagine evenings in the hut, men gathered around the stove, one of them reading aloud, his voice a steady drone against the howl of the wind outside, transporting his companions to distant lands or engrossing them in thrilling tales. A well-read book, shared amongst comrades, might eventually become less of a bound volume and more a cherished collection of loose, much-loved pages. And, of course, many men kept personal diaries and journals, a private space to record their observations, vent their frustrations, and maintain a connection with their inner selves. Music, too, played a vital role in lifting spirits. If the expedition was well-equipped, they might have a gramophone or phonograph with a selection of records. The crackly, tinny sound of a popular music hall tune, a stirring classical piece, or even a sentimental ballad drifting through the hut would have been a powerful antidote to the oppressive silence of the Antarctic. For more hands-on musical expression, you'd often find mouth organs, harmonicas, concertinas, perhaps a fiddle or a banjo, tucked away in someone's kit. Impromptu musical evenings, with sing-alongs and a varying degree of instrumental skill, were common. The enthusiasm of these performances, you might gently suggest, often outweighed the actual talent by a considerable margin, but no one much cared. It was the shared experience, the joy of making a joyful noise, however rudimentary, that mattered. After months of hearing only the wind and the creak of the ice, even the most out-of-tune harmonica probably started to sound like a welcome, if slightly wheezy, virtuoso. Games of all sorts were another essential provision for whiling away the hours and keeping minds active. Packs of playing cards were indispensable, used for countless games of whist, poker, or rummy, often played for stakes no higher than a portion of someone's chocolate ration or bragging rights. Chess and checkers sets would see intense, strategic battles waged, while dominoes clicked and clacked on makeshift tables. Word games, charades, and even homebrewed quizzes provided intellectual stimulation and much-needed laughter. These games weren't just about passing time. They were about engagement, competition, and social interaction, all vital for mental health and prolonged isolation. And these comforts weren't just for everyday use. They were central to marking special occasions. Christmas, Midwinter's Day, a significant celebration in the Antarctic when the sun begins its slow return. Birthdays, these were all observed with as much festivity as could be mustered. This is when the carefully hoarded special treats, the last tin of fancy biscuits, a small stash of chocolate, or an extra ration of that medicinal brandy we talked about, would be brought out. The cook would do his utmost to produce something resembling a feast, musical instruments would be dusted off, and perhaps an elaborate, amateur theatrical performance or a mock awards ceremony would be staged. These events, meticulously planned and eagerly anticipated, were bright sparks in the long darkness, vital for maintaining a sense of community and the passage of time. Beyond these communal comforts, there were the intensely personal ones. Photographs of wives, children, and sweethearts, carefully protected and brought out for quiet moments of remembrance. Letters from home, read and reread until the creases were worn through, each word a precious link to the world left behind. These small, personal mementos were anchors, reminding the men of the lives and loves they hoped to return to, fortifying their resolve. A quirky tidbit that often crops up in expedition diaries is the mention of some particularly unusual or cherished comfort item. Perhaps one man painstakingly transported a small, beloved painting to hang on the hut wall, or another had a specific, battered gramophone record that, through endless repetition, became either the expedition's unofficial anthem or the bane of everyone else's existence. Sometimes, entire theatrical productions, with elaborate costumes fashioned from spare blankets and painted canvas, were put on, showcasing surprising dramatic talents, or lack thereof. Social historians and psychologists studying expedition accounts still debate the relative efficacy of different types of morale-boosting activities and provisions, and whether leaders consciously understood and strategically deployed these comforts as tools for group cohesion and mental resilience, or if their inclusion was more haphazard, driven by individual preferences and the customs of the time. Regardless of the intent, their impact was undeniable. So, as you relax, surrounded by your own modern comforts, consider the profound importance of these simple pleasures in that stark, demanding world. A puff of tobacco smoke, the page of a good book, a familiar tune on a scratchy gramophone, a shared laugh over a game of cards. These were not mere diversions. They were the threads that helped hold the human spirit together, the small, warm lights that flickered defiantly against the overwhelming Antarctic darkness. You've been comfortably nestled in your warm bed, listening to tales of Antarctic life, of the small comforts, the pipe smoke, the shared laughter over a game of cards, the scratchy tune from a gramophone, that made existence bearable in that immense, frozen wilderness. These were the things that fed the soul. But what happened when the provisions for the body, those meticulously calculated tins of pemmican, sacks of biscuits, and cans of paraffin, began to falter? What happened when the careful sums didn't add up, when the depots were bare, or when the journey stretched agonizingly longer than planned? This, my friend, is when the true, chilling drama of Antarctic exploration often reached its tragic climax. The nightmare scenario for any polar explorer was, of course, running out. Running out of food when you're still hundreds of miles from safety, your body already emaciated and racked with exhaustion. Running out of fuel when the temperature is plummeting, meaning no hot food, no melted water, and a swift, cold end. It's one thing to face the abstract dangers of crevasses or blizzards. It's another to face the slow, gnawing certainty of starvation or freezing because the lifeline of supplies has snapped. At that point, even the most reviled, tooth-breaking ship's biscuit we discussed earlier would have seemed like a 7-course banquet. The most famous and poignant example of such a provisioning failure is, undoubtedly, Captain Robert Falcon Scott's party on their return journey from the South Pole in 1912. It's a mainstream historical fact that their tragic end was a complex tapestry woven from multiple threads of misfortune and miscalculation. Their rations, meticulously planned, proved to have a lower caloric value in the extreme cold than anticipated. The fuel in the depots they relied upon was found to be partially evaporated, meaning less hot food and life-giving drink than expected. They were plagued by unusually severe weather, slowing their progress to a crawl, and by the debilitating effects of scurvy and frostbite. Each day, they fell further behind schedule, their meager supplies dwindling with terrifying speed. Their diaries tell a harrowing tale of dwindling hope, of heroic endurance in the face of impossible odds, a slow march towards an inevitable end, just miles from a crucial supply depot. Then there's the story of Sir Ernest Shackleton's Imperial Transantarctic expedition. While their initial predicament wasn't about rations running out during a planned journey, the crushing of their ship, the Endurance, in the pack ice of the Weddell Sea in 1915, meant the sudden and catastrophic loss of the bulk of their carefully laid provisions. They were marooned on drifting ice floes with only what they could salvage and what they could hunt. Their survival became a legendary feat of leadership, resilience, and improvisation, relying heavily on seals and penguins for food and fuel, a stark example of what happens when planned provisions utterly fail and you are thrown back onto the most primitive means of existence. It was a desperate scramble, where every salvaged biscuit, every scrap of blubber, became currency for another day of life. These are the famous examples, but many other expeditions, less chronicled, faced their own desperate struggles with dwindling supplies. Near misses, where parties made it back to safety with literally nothing left, were not uncommon. So what caused these failures? Sometimes it was sheer miscalculation, underestimating the brutal energy demands of Antarctic travel or the time a journey would take. Sometimes it was the loss or damage of supplies, tins leaking and their contents spoiling, fuel evaporating from improperly sealed containers, or vital caches being inexplicably difficult to locate in the white wilderness. Sometimes depots, those crucial stepping stones of food and fuel laid out in advance, were found to be inadequately stocked, or the landmarks guiding to them had been obliterated by blizzards. Unexpected delays, whether from prolonged storms, impassable terrain, or sickness within the party, could throw even the most careful calculations into disarray. Contingency plans, if they existed, sometimes seemed to consist of little more than hoping for a very large, very friendly, and conveniently passing albatross carrying a packed lunch. When such crises hit, the human element came starkly to the fore. The leadership of men like Shackleton, who managed to maintain discipline and hope amidst unimaginable hardship, was extraordinary. Difficult decisions about rationing, about who received the last scraps of food, about whether to press on or to try and conserve energy, had to be made. There were instances of incredible self-sacrifice, and also, inevitably, moments of despair and fracturing morale. A quirky, though grim, tidbit from some polar narratives is the concept of a phantom depot, a supply cache that a starving, exhausted party believed to be just over the next ridge, only for it to be a cruel trick of the landscape, a mirage born of desperation, or a misremembered location from a frost-addled brain. The psychological blow of such a disappointment, on top of the physical suffering, is hard to fathom. The lessons learned from these harrowing experiences were, of course, bought at a terrible price, but they profoundly shaped the future of polar exploration. Subsequent expeditions paid far more meticulous attention to the caloric values of rations, the types of food best suited for extreme cold, the secure packaging of fuel, and the robust marking and stocking of depots. The science of nutrition, the understanding of cold weather physiology, and the technology of transport and communication all advanced, partly driven by the desire to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Historians and polar logistics experts still analyze the what-ifs of famous polar tragedies, debating whether specific alternative provisioning strategies or different leadership decisions could realistically have altered the outcomes, or if some parties were simply overwhelmed by unforeseeable environmental extremes and the inherent limitations of the technology and knowledge of their time. It's a sobering reminder that even the most detailed plans can unravel in the face of Antarctica's unforgiving power. The meticulous planning for collecting, say, obscure moss samples, as we discussed earlier, sometimes stood in stark, ironic contrast to an underestimation of something as fundamental as the biscuit ration needed to get home safely. These stories of when the rations ran out are not just tales of suffering. They are testaments to the limits of human endurance, the importance of foresight, and the often thin line between triumph and tragedy that defined the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. They underscore, more than anything, that in Antarctica, your provisions weren't just supplies. They were your very lifeline. And so, our journey through the strange and essential provisions of those early Antarctic expeditions comes to a gentle close. We've unpacked the pemmican and the biscuits, shivered at the thought of scurvy, and warmed our hands by imaginary blubber stoves. We've seen how a simple tin of jam, a beloved book, or a few carefully hoarded ounces of tobacco could mean the difference between despair and a flicker of hope in the vast, icy silence. The echoes of those early explorers, their triumphs and their tragedies, still whisper across the frozen landscapes, carried on the relentless wind. Their hastily scribbled notes on fuel consumption, their debates over the best type of biscuit, their desperate reliance on fresh seal meat. These details, once matters of life and death, now drift into the realm of history, a testament to the human spirit's incredible capacity for endurance and its occasional, poignant fallibility when faced with the overwhelming power of nature. But you are here, safe and warm, far from those icy challenges. The struggles for sustenance, for warmth, for a moment's comfort in that alien world, are now just stories to guide you softly towards your own peaceful rest. Let the images of those vast, white plains, the thought of those carefully packed sledges, and the quiet courage of the men who relied upon them, now recede like a distant dream. There is no more cold to endure, no more rations to calculate, only the quiet comfort of your own bed, the gentle rhythm of your own breath. Allow yourself to drift, to let go, feeling secure and at ease, as the last vestiges of our Antarctic tale fade into the quiet stillness of the night.